Egypt, a land of hidden treasures, buried secrets, and centuries-old mysteries left unsolved. The reign of its last queen, Cleopatra, brought chaos and disaster. She saw 3,000 years of civilization end, but her story's been buried in myth, and almost every trace of her has been lost or destroyed. Can today's experts piece together the true story of Egypt's last pharaoh, Cleopatra? Most people know the name Cleopatra. She's remembered as a legendary temptress and for the men she seduced. The true story of Egypt's last queen has been obscured by soap opera and scandal.
The life of Cleopatra is a mystery, but she was a magical queen. Her beauty captured the hearts of the most two powerful people on earth.
She was in charge when the great civilization of ancient Egypt finally fell. And the version we have of Cleopatra's story was written by the men who defeated her, the Romans.
The Romans put the spin on the Cleopatra tale. They turned her into a salacious harlot, this bubble-headed sex kitten who's jumping in and out of bed with any available Roman.
But there was more to her than that. This was a woman who came to power at 18 and kept the Romans at bay for over 20 years. The more historians discover about her, the more she appears as an extraordinary woman of her times. One who made no distinction between private and political life. The choices she made helped shape world history. And yet physical evidence of her reign is hard to find.
Even though Cleopatra is so famous, most of what we know about her is hearsay or myth. It's important to look for Egyptian evidence of Cleopatra because she's the ruler of Egypt. It's her home and it's her country. If we find Egyptian evidence, then we'll have the Egyptians' own perspective on Cleopatra's reign, not the Romans.
Cleopatra was born into a unique period in Egyptian history, one where two cultures had fused to produce an entirely new society. While she may be remembered as an Egyptian, she was actually the product of a Greek dynasty who'd arrived in Egypt some 300 years before.
These people were basically Greeks from northern Greece in Macedonia, what we call it today. The dynasty was founded by Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who followed him across Asia. He essentially took control of Egypt and founded his own dynasty here. Essentially, the Ptolemies were Greek and Egyptian.
The Egyptians had been building their own unmistakable monuments for 2,500 years, but the Ptolemies still left their mark. Egypt's cities are full of ruined Greek-style buildings. Even here at Saqqara, the pharaoh's ancient burial ground, there are statues of great Greek thinkers, Homer, Plato, and others.
After several unremarkable Ptolemaic rulers, the last real ruler of the Ptolemaic period of Egypt was Cleopatra. She ended that Hellenistic period begun by Alexander several hundred years previously.
But the Ptolemies didn't trample on Egyptian tradition. They went to great lengths to show that they respected it. They adopted local customs, depicting themselves in Egyptian dress and building new temples to Egyptian gods. Evidence of this fusion of cultures still survives across Egypt, but one of the best examples lies hidden beneath the streets of modern Alexandria.
Colin Clement visits the Hadrianic tombs of Kom el Shafka in the southwest of the city.
This is a guardian of the tomb, head of Anubis. Now, Anubis represents the ancient Egyptian religion. He was the god of the afterworld. And then down here, rather than legs, we have the tail of the Agatha demon snake, a beneficial god of the Hellenistic period. This is a perfect example of the mix that Alexandria become.
And this reflects the world into which Cleopatra was born. These two great cultures, fusing here, dominated the ancient world, defining the way people thought, lived, and built.
It is rather clumsily done. It's a mishmash. But nonetheless, it is very, very striking.
In Ptolemaic Egypt, the mixing of Greeks and Egyptians resulted in a melting pot, and Alexandria was typical of that, so that people understood Greek and Egyptian language, and they started to make architecture and art that used some Greek forms, but also some Egyptian elements.
The same mix would have played a part in the way Cleopatra was brought up. She had an Egyptian's belief in the absolute power of the pharaoh and a Greek's reverence for knowledge and learning.
She could be regarded as the ultimate educated woman. She was clearly a woman of stature, of great intellect and multilingual skills.
Contemporary experts believe that Cleopatra's education prepared her for victory in the wider world. She was taught to speak 9 or 10 languages.
Her knowledge as a queen to rule Egypt came because she lived in the most cultured, wonderful city in the world in that time.
We could consider her the epitome of learning and aristocratic bearing, perhaps linked to the idea of Alexandria as the center of learning in the ancient world, focused on the famous Alexandria Library.
Alexandria's library was at the heart of Cleopatra's world. Today, the place where it once stood is occupied by a modern library, built as a monument to the ancient building. Centuries before the coming of the printing press, it's said to have held over 700,000 scrolls. Generations of Cleopatra's ancestors were ruthless in their ambition to make this city an international center of learning and ideas.
The Ptolemies went aggressively to try to get a copy of every single book that was in existence. And they even had customs agents search vessels that pulled into the port. And if they found a book on board that was not in the library, the book was confiscated and brought to the library. It represents the world's first think tank. And the Ptolemies, Cleopatra included, were in a position to pay scholars simply to think and use their brains. She encouraged research and scholarship on a purely academic, intellectual, idealistic level.
But there's another building which reveals how Cleopatra's dynasty wanted to be seen. A structure that represented their public face. It was literally the first thing that anyone arriving at the port of Alexandria would see. The Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
There are written texts from antiquity which tell us of this large tower built of white stone standing on the tip of the Isle of Pharos. So we have images, but none are hugely detailed.
These texts describe an impossibly high monument, built during the reign of Cleopatra's forefather Ptolemy, as a beacon by which ships could navigate. But while we know the pharaohs existed, we don't know for certain what it looked like.
The breakthrough in the recent years is our discovery of elements of the monumental doorway to it. We've found both door jambs and the lintel.
Jean-Yves Empereur led the team which, in 1994, uncovered these massive pieces of stone lying on the seabed. He believes they once formed the doorway of the Pharos.
These are 2 fragments of the colossal gate of the lighthouse. And it was broken with an earthquake. And so we could pick them out from the seawater. But still there is the other one, the twin one, and also the lintel. And so we have the complete frame, and with the base, it's more than 11 meters, 45 centimeters high.
The stones reveal that the Pharos was another combination of Egyptian and Greek elements.
You know, this stone speaks by itself. It's granite from Aswan, so it means that it was carved by Egyptian craftsmen. But it was used in this Greek construction of the lighthouse, the symbol of Alexandria.
The doorway was made from 3 solid blocks of granite, each weighing more than 100 tons. it stood almost 38 feet high. Clearly, any building whose doorway had these monumental proportions must have been big. A major clue to what the whole building looked like lies 30 miles along the coast. Cleopatra researcher Andrea Kay is visiting what some believe to be a copy of the Pharos. Only this is a scaled-down version.
We are at the lighthouse at Taposiris Magna. In Ptolemaic times, this was a very large settlement, and this lighthouse is built on a Ptolemaic cemetery. It probably served as a burial monument of some kind and possibly a signal tower.
The Pharos was at least 4 times the height of this tower, but Andrea Kay believes its shape and proportions are the same.
It's got a large square base with an octagonal middle section and a cylindrical top.
This exactly matches ancient descriptions of the Pharos. Using the design of this lighthouse and the scale dictated by the doorway found in the harbour, it's possible to create a picture of how the landmark at the gateway to Cleopatra's empire might have looked. Standing almost 400 feet high, this was among the tallest buildings on Earth, right up until its destruction in the 14th century. If the builder's intention was to win prestige, it worked.
The Pharos Lighthouse was a feat of engineering that welcomed any visitor into the harbour at Alexandria, but it also showed the world that Alexandria was the centre of power in the Mediterranean.
The Ptolemies had a word for it, trophy, sometimes translated into English as luxury, and trophy means everything in excess. Philanthropic endeavors, building endeavors. So whatever it is that you're doing, go over the top when you're doing it. And you could go over the top because you had unlimited resources at your disposal.
This would have been Cleopatra's inheritance, boundless self-belief, and the freedom to rule. But the city that Egyptologists are trying to rediscover was under threat. Cleopatra's ancient empire was about to sink from view. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, was the product of a unique culture and of extraordinary times. To truly understand her, today's archaeologists are delving into the world which she came from and which she left irrevocably changed. That means looking at Alexandria, the city where events which would alter the course of history were played out. But in the 2,000 years since a Roman army seized Cleopatra's empire, the city's moved on. Alexandria is now a sprawling modern metropolis. Painting a picture of the city that Cleopatra knew involves a lot of detective work. Egyptologist Andrea Kay is using a GPS system to map the exact locations of the few landmarks which survive from antiquity.
We're trying to get a better idea about the layout of the ancient city of Alexandria by mapping it on a computer.
She's collating information gleaned from ancient accounts and from the maps that predate the city's modern development. It enables her to identify where key buildings once stood.
It gives you a better idea of what was there, and by piecing it all together, we can try to complete that picture as best we can to try and understand the kind of city that Cleopatra lived in.
In 2,000 years, the very shape of the landscape has changed. Since Cleopatra's time, there's been a lot of erosion and subsidence of the land. And over the centuries, the old city's been built upon time and time again. Any undiscovered ancient remains lie a long way below street level. For scholars hunting evidence of Cleopatra and the world she knew, the focus of interest has to be on what was the heart of her city, the Palace District.
This would have been a very important part of the city that Cleopatra lived in. She would have lived right over there. It would have been one of the most opulent portions of the city, and the Palace District taking up a whole fifth of the area inside the city walls.
This is one part of the city where we know Cleopatra lived. But archaeologists have always assumed that it was lost forever.
The sea levels have changed so much that part of the city, the part that bordered the harbour, is now underwater. It's in an unfortunate location in terms of earthquake and seismic action. So it has suffered from earthquakes and even a report of a tsunami, a kind of tidal wave, in the 4th century AD.
But one man was convinced there were still clues out there waiting to be found. In the early 1990s, marine archaeologist Frank Goddio began diving in the harbour. He was looking for fragments. What he found was a sunken city. He and his team had begun to exhibit some of the many items they'd brought to the surface. Evidence of a uniquely rich culture.
First, we dove to see if something could be seen, and you could see only sediment, nothing. Everything was buried under the sediment, underwater. Then we had to start doing underwater excavation, and little by little we saw red granite. And it was a block of red granite, and cleaning it, I saw hieroglyph. And this was the first artifact we found in Alexandria Great Harbor. We found thousands and thousands of artifacts, beautiful sculptures. It's a kind of a vision from the past and of everything which was there in the past.
There were ruined buildings, as well as statues honouring various gods and pharaohs. Each object added to an emerging picture of ancient Alexandria. And finally, a breakthrough, a find they could tie directly to Cleopatra.
We found sometimes artifacts related to her. We found, for example, the likeness of the father of Cleopatra.
Did she commission this statue or witness its construction? Another bust has an even stronger personal connection.
We found also a beautiful head of black granite, and it has been identified as Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar.
This is a bust of Cleopatra's son Caesarion, fathered by Julius Caesar, then murdered by his successor. It's thought to have stood alongside a statue of Cleopatra herself. It identifies the harbour site where it was found as the location of the Ptolemies' palace. Together, the finds from the underwater excavations provide a tangible link to a time that has passed into legend. They bring us face to face with the city of the real Cleopatra.
In the mind of everybody, there is a merge between Cleopatra and Alexandria. It's a kind of synonym. And Alexandria had a very important role in the development of the Western world and in passing the messages of the antiquity to the new Western world.
The fact that Alexandria existed at all is a testament to the determination of the Ptolemies, including Cleopatra. Essentially a Greek city in the heart of Egypt, it was built from sheer force of will, its rulers overcoming problems which might have halted completely the development of a lesser city. Nick Saunders is leaving modern Alexandria behind and descending into an underground complex which demonstrates the extraordinary sophistication of the Ptolemies. These dark caverns housed one of the many cisterns used to distribute the city's drinking water. Without them, Alexandria could never even have survived, let alone flourished, as it developed without a freshwater supply.
These underground cisterns really sort of bring us as near as we're likely to get to the ancient city of Alexandria during the reign of Cleopatra.
These cathedral-like spaces tell us just how technologically advanced the people of Alexandria were. Not only did they solve the problem of storing drinking water, but they're built on a scale and with a precision that's impressive even today.
The Nile flooded and the water was trapped and fed into these underground cisterns, and there it was stored until it was needed. So it was a very elaborate and clever way of storing fresh water for an ever larger population in the city.
The Ptolemies' determination to build their capital here meant they found ways of overcoming what could seem like insurmountable problems. Without these hidden cisterns, Alexandria could never have become a truly great city.
The city that Cleopatra lived in and helped to make famous was really sort of underwritten by the ability to create and store vast quantities of water in these cisterns. They were the engine that powered ancient Alexandria. They're a masterpiece of underground hydraulic engineering.
The effects of what unfolded here during Cleopatra's reign would be felt around the world. But in those dying days of the Egyptian Empire, Alexandria shone as the greatest city on earth.
The Alexandria of Cleopatra was the be-all and end-all. Some people say it's the New York of the times, the Paris, you pick the capital. It was the place to be. So what you're looking at is this glistening marble metropolis, and Rome living in wooden hovels, a hick town, as opposed to the hip jet-set place to be.
And it was this very prosperity which put not only Alexandria, but the whole of Egypt at risk of invasion. The problem for Cleopatra and the people of Egypt was that they were victims of their own success. Egypt had an apparently inexhaustible source of wealth, bound to make other powers envious. For 3,000 years, the River Nile had nourished Egyptian civilization. Its annual flood brought millions of tons of fertile soil, saturating the plains and creating rich farmlands. Egypt grew grain. The economy grew fat.
The agricultural potential of the country, the ability of its grain resources to feed Rome and the Roman Empire. This is really what set Rome on the course for collision with Cleopatra.
After Cleopatra's death, her country would become Rome's breadbasket, supplying a third of its grain. Now in Alexandria, beneath the city streets, experts have found eyewitness evidence of the chain of events which destroyed both the Queen and her empire. Cleopatra didn't know that she would be the last of the Ptolemies, a dynasty that had ruled in Egypt for 300 years. She'd grown up with a sense of her family's superiority, their greatness, their right to rule. She took the throne aged 18.
How does unbridled wealth and absolute advantage affect anyone? She can be a dominant force, a mistress, if you will, of a nation that spans from Alexandria maybe as far as Rome.
But she immediately faced a crisis that had long been brewing.
The Ptolemies had basically sucked Egypt dry. Their total incompetence as rulers, their failure in the military field, their inability to control their courtiers and the priesthood, and their real self-indulgence had basically sunk the dynasty to the lowest depths it had ever been.
This was what Cleopatra inherited, an empire on a collision course with disaster. Her reign began with a power struggle. Her brother seized the throne, and the displaced queen was forced into hiding. At the Anfushi tombs, hidden beneath the modern city, Jean-Yves Empereur finds contemporary evidence of what happened next.
First of all, it's very surprising to find here such fragile drawings made by simple charcoal.
These crude charcoal drawings depict a single event which was to change Cleopatra's entire world. Seeing an opportunity to gain power in a weakened Egypt, Rome sent a fleet of ships to Alexandria. At its head was Julius Caesar.
His troops and the crew of his fleet escaped from the battle and stayed in this kind of shelter.
These graffiti are a 2,000-year-old record of one of the most notorious meetings in ancient history. Caesar's arrival and intervention on Cleopatra's behalf allowed her to take back the throne. He was clearly charmed by her, and once he'd removed her younger brother, they began an affair. For Cleopatra's part, the arrival of the Romans didn't mean a handover of power, so much as an opportunity to return Egypt to greatness. The meeting is usually portrayed as a seduction, but it had vast political significance.
Rome was probably going to be her worst enemy or her best ally. And so when Cleopatra and Caesar actually met, they both were on the same page with regard to what they wanted. They wanted world domination, and they realized that united, they would be able to realize that dream as opposed to being enemies and having to fight each other.
In this version of events, Cleopatra wasn't Caesar's mistress, but his partner. She wasn't surrendering so much as forging an alliance. They had a son, and though he bore his father's name, Caesarion, Cleopatra went to great pains to show he had, through her, the blood of a true pharaoh. Bob Bianchi is examining the evidence of this 500 miles south of Alexandria on the temple.
Cleopatra made very clear that she was the goddess Hathor, and it was also very widely implied that Caesar was the king Horus. So the statue of the god Horus, representing Caesar in this case, would have been placed in the bark, which is essentially a mobile shrine, carried among the people to the river and transported to Dendera, where Hathor, also Cleopatra, had the female portion.
This was a piece of propaganda as much as a religious ritual. When Caesar and Cleopatra came together, she didn't become Roman. Rather, Caesar took on an Egyptian identity. The fact that he was portrayed as Horus, the pharaoh's own god who united and protected Egypt, is highly significant.
This is Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, and he's being shown here as protected by the god Horus, whose temple this is. We see in Dendera how Cleopatra shows herself as Hathor. We see here how Horus may represent Caesar, and now we have Caesarion, who is the divine child of the two gods.
It was Cleopatra who created this statue, and it's possible to deduce what she was thinking. She was literally placing her son under the protection of Caesar, perhaps because she knew that Roman domination of the ancient world was, in the end, inevitable. The woman who commissioned these monuments is a far more complicated character than the seductress of legend. This is Cleopatra as politician, propagandist, and leader.
A position of weakness may have forced her into alliance with Rome, but she used it to her advantage, protecting her country from invasion.
As Egyptologists delve deeper into her story, they can get closer to seeing who this extraordinary queen really was.
And in one of this country's most sacred sites,
New evidence reveals how she aimed to be remembered, by taking up a place amongst Egypt's greatest kings. The picture that's emerging of Cleopatra is of a politician and a propagandist, someone concerned with creating a legacy, with projecting the image of herself as a great pharaoh. But this leaves Egyptologists with a puzzle. Robert Bianchi is near Luxor, site of one of the ancient world's largest religious complexes, Karnak. The pharaohs were building monuments here for 2,000 years before Cleopatra.
And every major pharaoh of Egypt, Tutankhamun, Ramses, Amenhotep, all left their name here, including the Ptolemies. So we've got almost a 2,000-year span of history here.
It was almost obligatory for a pharaoh to build a monument here and leave his mark. So where is Cleopatra's?
We would expect that a strong nationalistic queen like Cleopatra herself would have done something to leave her mark here.
It seems unlikely she simply neglected to do what others had done. Perhaps Cleopatra did leave something here, but the people who came after her sought to obliterate any trace of her. Bob Bianchi is convinced by the circumstantial evidence that Cleopatra did build at Karnak.
We know, for example, that in the 2nd century AD, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, a very, very important priestly family living in this area had their female members named Cleopatra. So her memory existed, and that living memory strongly suggests that there must have been monuments here that would have reinforced their naming of the children after this great queen.
It may have been torn down deliberately. It may have lain forgotten in this 100-acre site. But finding what Cleopatra left here has become a mission for some archaeologists, part of restoring her reputation. They're rediscovering a story that's been buried or hidden or mistold for 2,000 years. Now a new find from a section of the site known as the Avenue of Sphinxes suggests the search is over. Thousands of statues once lined the route between Karnak and the temple at Luxor. Each one bears the head of a pharaoh and the body of a lion. It was long thought these statues predated Cleopatra by some 300 years. But new thinking suggests this may not be the case.
We just found a new head for one of the sphinxes which were here. It seems that this head was made during the Ptolemaic period.
Judging by the style of the statue and the face it represents, Mansour Bareik believes it comes from much closer to Cleopatra's time.
The eyes are bigger, the eyebrows are longer, so I'm sure that Ptolemies added sphinxes on this ceremonial route.
It's one of a number of similar statues, all found close together. Their presence convinced Bareik and his team that they should focus their search here. Eventually, he made the discovery that generations of archaeologists have searched for: an oblong carving containing the name Cleopatra, the sacred cartouche of the Great Queen.
Here we have a nice evidence about Cleopatra. A block of sandstone. So you can see the cartouche of Cleopatra, you can see here, flanked with the cobra. This is an evidence of the history of Cleopatra lost world. This is, a piece shows us that Cleopatra did something here.
For Egyptologists, this block is a tremendous discovery. It brings us within touching distance of Cleopatra's world. But it's also a reminder of how little physical evidence there is. Ramesses the Great left his name across Egypt and built an empire in stone. Khufu built the Great Pyramid, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Typically, a pharaoh filled his temples with statues of himself. But not Cleopatra. There are no grand statues of her in Alexandria. To find a likeness of the Queen in this city, it's necessary to look at something rather more humble: coins. Colin Clement has come to this warehouse to see the relics of a lost financial empire.
Marvellous to find coins in such good condition and to find actual coins of Cleopatra, who is, of course, extremely famous, but ultimately not very well known in terms of physical archaeological corroboration. Her renown is worldwide, but within the city that she ruled, there's very, very few signs of her presence.
The fact that they survive today is extraordinary, but the coins were also remarkable in their own time.
We have the profile of Cleopatra herself. I mean, she's not strikingly beautiful despite all the myths and legends that go along with her. It is clearly her. What does it tell us about it? Well, in terms of Egyptian or Ptolemaic coinage, you don't get female representation except alongside the ruling king. Here we have the head of the sovereign. So you know that Cleopatra was in charge of the country. She was the ruler.
In their 3,000-year history, there were only 5 occasions when the ancient Egyptian people were ruled by a female pharaoh alone. Cleopatra's reign was one of them. But Bob Bianchi believes these coins weren't intended for the Egyptian people.
The ancient Egyptians did not use coins. They used barter. The coins that Cleopatra mints were meant to pay the Greek people in her employ. So the coins become currency for propaganda rather than identifications. This is what the queen looks like.
So the face on these coins was meant to be seen by people outside her empire. Not Cleopatra as she looked in life, but rather Cleopatra as she wanted to be seen. Not the victim of spin that she would later become, but the master of it. On the coin, she portrays herself as a classical Greek, calling to mind her ancestral connection to Alexander the Great. But on the temple walls at Dendera, she is pure Egyptian, the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. So how did Cleopatra see herself? The Ptolemies and their royal court remained proud of their Greek heritage. It's said that Cleopatra was the first to learn the language of her Egyptian subjects, and research now suggests she may not only have had Greek blood.
She probably wasn't just completely European. You've got to remember that her family had actually lived in Egypt for almost 300 years at the time when she came to power.
Sally Ann Ashton has spent years studying artifacts to find what she believes is the truest physical likeness of Cleopatra. Her ancestry was complex, so she presented herself in different ways to different people.
The reason I chose this particular ring was because it's Egyptian, it shows Cleopatra as Isis, and it shows a very young Cleopatra. And I think given that she was only 40 when she died, this is the kind of image that we need to be looking at.
The image on this ring is important. It was made and displayed in Cleopatra's time. Converted into a 3D model, it may be as close as we're able to get to seeing the face of one of history's most powerful women. In the past, whenever Cleopatra's story's been told, her looks, her supposed legendary beauty, have played an important part. But it's clear this is a caricature. This is the woman who met Julius Caesar, a conqueror, a dictator, and forged an alliance.
Julius Caesar and Cleopatra knew what each other wanted. They were mental equals, political equals, and they were both as cunning and conniving as you could possibly be.
Caesar and Cleopatra's alliance lasted 4 years. It appears to have worked so well for her that it caused jealousy and concern in Rome.
The senators were very disturbed by Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra, and it was probably because of this situation that they eventually did decide to murder him.
Whatever their motive, the assassins who ended Caesar's life in 44 BC also ended a time of stability in Egypt. And whether Cleopatra felt the loss personally or politically, it's believed she dedicated a great monument to Caesar in the center of Alexandria. Today, the site where the Caesareum stood is boxed in by modern buildings. Recent excavations have found evidence of a Roman-style construction.
Here we're looking at a statue of Roman Emperor Septimus Severus, which we found on our dig on the site of the Caesareum. Begun at the time of Cleopatra, but ultimately taken on as a site dedicated to the cult of the emperor, the cult of the Roman Caesar.
The building had a life after Cleopatra's death. When the Romans had finally installed themselves in Egypt and their emperors came to be worshipped as gods, the Caesareum became a cult temple. Originally constructed as an Egyptian monument to a mourned friend of Egypt, it was enlarged and extended, a reminder in stone of Rome's dominant presence and power.
There are descriptions by Philo of Alexandria. He certainly says that it was splendid, it was rich, it was adorned with many statues. The overall impression of it is being a rich, rich cult site, which would figure if it's dedicated to the emperor.
But by the time that account was written, whatever structure Cleopatra had built was probably long gone, swept away by the Roman forces, which some experts say tried to erase her from history. Because Cleopatra was there when Rome nearly tore itself apart. After Caesar's death, she began a relationship with Mark Antony. When it was over, they would both be dead. and Egypt would not have an independent Egyptian ruler until the second half of the 20th century. The final act of her life would be the final act of the Egyptian civilization. With the death of Julius Caesar, Cleopatra had lost her most powerful ally in Rome, and what had been a relationship of equals was set to become that of predator and prey. Two men claimed the right to be Caesar's heir. As they fought, Egypt became the prize.
Mark Antony was a Roman general, and he was sort of the right-hand man of Julius Caesar. And after Caesar's death, Mark Antony was sharing power with Octavian. They were sharing the rule of Rome, and Mark Antony was given the eastern part. So because of that, he came to Egypt, and he met Cleopatra, and of course, began a relationship with her.
The relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra produced 3 children. It's remembered as a doomed romance, but it may also have been another smart move on Cleopatra's part.
With Julius Caesar out of the picture, Cleopatra still needed an ally in Rome. Securing Mark Antony's support was another canny move on Cleopatra's part, helping her to protect Egypt's interests.
Cleopatra needed a strong, powerful ally to replace Julius Caesar, and the only candidate that was viable was Mark Antony. And the two of them ultimately forged an alliance where they thought that they would pool their resources together, fight against Octavian, and the winner would take everything.
Roman historians recorded how, in a ceremony called the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra divided up their empire and made their children heads of state. Cleopatra was to rule Egypt with Caesarion, while the rest of the lands were divided between the 3 children she'd had with Mark Antony. But the idea he was giving territories away made him new enemies at home.
The reason it fell badly on Roman sensibilities were that these territories were not Antony's to give.
With strengthened support, Mark Antony's rival, Octavian, saw an opportunity for final victory.
Mark Antony and Cleopatra went into a naval battle with Octavian, and they were defeated, and there was no coming back from it. And they both knew it, and they both sank into despair when they returned to Egypt, just waiting for Octavian to come back and take control of the country. Mark Antony fell on his sword and was taken to Cleopatra in his final death throes and died in her arms.
Her lover was lost. Egypt was lost. She too committed suicide.
We don't actually know how Cleopatra died. Roman writers have given us 2 different versions of how Cleopatra killed herself. Either she ate a poisoned fig from a basket of figs, or she used an asp, a poisonous snake, which would have been a symbol of magic and power in Egyptian religion.
Even Cleopatra's suicide seemed an act of defiance. By taking her own life, she prevented Octavian parading her through Rome as a symbol of his triumph. But with Cleopatra's death, the last barrier protecting Egypt was removed. Octavian declared himself the first emperor, Augustus Caesar. The Egyptian people immediately became Roman subjects.
After the death of Cleopatra, Egypt became just another province in the Roman Empire, albeit a very wealthy and important province.
Gradually, over time, Egyptian traditions like the language and religion faded away, and Egypt wouldn't be an independent country again for almost 2,000 years.
At the Avenue of Sphinxes, Mansa Baraik's dig has uncovered evidence from the Roman period demonstrating what Cleopatra had been trying to prevent throughout her reign.
They changed Egypt to be their grain basket, and they began to rule it by force, and they began to collect the taxes from the Egyptians by force, and they began to use the military, the soldiers, in ruling the country.
With the Romans' arrival, religious structures had to make way for industrial ones. And Baraik's finds suggest they actively sought to erase Cleopatra and the Ptolemies from history.
This is a real evidence in our hands about what happened after Cleopatra was defeated in 31 BC. The Romans changed part of the Sphinx Avenue to be an industrial area. They began to build the workshops here, But the unique thing also that they dismantled, they destroyed some structures were built by the Ptolemies, and they reused these blocks in their buildings. You can see the remains of the scenes here, the reliefs here, and even if you look here to this profile, and you can see the features of the Ptolemaic period.
But it wasn't only the buildings from Cleopatra's era which were torn down. The Romans also tried to suppress the Egyptian religion, which Cleopatra had fought for so long to protect. Bob Bianchi finds evidence of this at Luxor Temple.
Egyptian religion has to be practiced according to the architecture, and I think that we would say that the function of the building follows the form of the building. So in an Egyptian complex such as this, the long vertical axis is key to the way the religion is practiced.
This was especially true of the festival of Opet, the ceremony which had previously been associated with Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. It centered around the procession of holy boats through the temple. The Romans, keen to force their own beliefs on the Egyptians, erected a wall to block this route.
In order to be able to force the population of Egypt to worship the Roman emperors, this critical axis that was so important for the Opet festival was bridged. The wall was closed, and the walls were painted with scenes of the cult of the Roman emperors. They altered the function of the temple and prohibited the boat from making its traditional journey, and we see, in a sense, a strangulation, a cutting off of ancient Egyptian religious traditions.
Cleopatra's defeat and death opened the door for full-scale Roman occupation of Egypt. But can this be seen as her own personal failing? Many historians argue that without her, Roman domination would have come far sooner. The proof she frustrated the Romans lies in the fact that they tried to blacken and even erase her name. Setting aside the Roman view of her, the evidence paints a portrait of a unique woman. She presided over one of the greatest cities in antiquity and left her mark at some of the most beautiful temples. For 2 decades, she protected her country from the world's first superpower. She simply couldn't stem the tide of history.
The story of Cleopatra is the twilight of Egyptian civilization as we know it. We looked at Egyptian civilization from the pyramids through Tutankhamun, through Alexander the Great, and with her death, pharaonic civilization ceases because the next ruler, Augustus, is an absentee landlord, and there is no monarch present in Egypt. She is the last page of the last chapter of the glory that was Egypt.